The room was thick with tension. A dozen teachers, some standing, others sitting behind their desks, stared at the small figure standing before them. His back was straight, hands trembling slightly as they held the violin, his bow poised in the air. The child's eyes were locked on the music sheet in front of him, though his mind was elsewhere, focused on the task at hand. In the back of the room, a few students whispered, trying to make out what was happening. They didn't understand. How could they? It wasn't just a violin lesson today, it was the moment where one boy's entire future seemed to hang by the thinnest of threads. The teachers' faces were unreadable, a blend of curiosity and disbelief. He didn't belong here, not in their world. He was different. A black boy from a working-class neighborhood who had somehow found his way into this prestigious music academy. Most of the teachers had been skeptical from the start. They thought it was a joke when his name was called to perform. "Are you sure about this?" one of them had asked when the schedule was posted. "He doesn't seem like the type." The others had agreed, their laughter forced but polite. It wasn't meant to be cruel, it was just the way things were. They had all made assumptions. It wasn't intentional, but it was ingrained in them, this unspoken belief that talent and privilege often came hand in hand. And so, the boy had been told he would perform today. Not because anyone believed in him, but because it was an obligation. The academy's reputation was on the line, and they couldn't risk leaving anyone behind, not even someone like him. But deep down, the teachers weren't prepared for what was about to happen. No one was. He exhaled deeply, his heart pounding in his chest. The bow hovered above the violin, trembling. He was terrified, but this wasn't about fear. No, this was about something much bigger, about proving to himself, to the world, and to them that he was worthy. He'd played this piece countless times, in his room, in the silence of the dark. His hands knew the movements by heart. But here, in front of these judgmental eyes, it was different. His fingers burned with the weight of their expectations. He could feel the sneers before they were even given voice. The moment he began, however, everything changed. The first note filled the air, quivering with life. The sound was not what they had expected. It wasn't tentative or unsure, it was confident, bold, and raw. He drew the bow across the strings, the melody spilling out, weaving through the room with a sense of urgency, a force that immediately caught everyone off guard. The teachers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from amusement to something else. A small flicker of surprise. The boy didn't pause, didn't hesitate. He continued, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm, his face the picture of concentration. The music wasn't just notes strung together. It was a language, a story told through the soft hum of the strings, the sharp bursts of the bow. It was his story. A story of survival. Of struggle. Of dreams held tightly in the darkness and finally allowed to breathe. As his performance built, so did the intensity in the room. The teachers, once skeptical, now found themselves unable to look away. Each note was like a punch to the gut, pulling them deeper into the boy's world. They began to question themselves, their preconceived notions slipping away one by one, as the performance unfolded before them. The piece he played wasn't a simple melody, it was an orchestration of emotions, a reflection of every challenge he had faced and every victory he had claimed, no matter how small. His hands moved with precision, his bow almost flying across the strings with each stroke, painting a soundscape of determination and resilience. But there was more beneath the surface. As the music grew louder, more powerful, it felt like something else was rising, something that had been buried deep within him for years, something he hadn't even realized he could express. The music became an outlet, an unstoppable force breaking free. The teachers were no longer just hearing the sound of a violin, they were hearing the story of this young boy's life. His silence. His struggles. His unspoken dreams. They were hearing the echo of every moment he had been overlooked, every doubt cast upon him simply because of who he was. They heard it all in the power of his performance, and it left them speechless. A few of the teachers, the ones who had once whispered and smirked, felt a sense of discomfort settle deep in their stomachs. They had made a mistake. A big one. It wasn't just that the boy was playing beautifully, it was that they had misunderstood him. They had written him off without truly seeing him, without understanding his potential, his drive. And now, as the last note echoed through the room, the silence was deafening. It wasn't just the end of the piece, it was the end of their assumptions. The boy's hands trembled, but it wasn't fear, it was relief. Relief that he had proven something. Not to them, but to himself. For a moment, no one moved. The teachers were too stunned to react. Then, slowly, one by one, they began to rise. Some nodded, a sign of respect. Others blinked, as if they were coming out of a trance. But no one spoke. They didn't need to. The music had already said it all. He lowered his violin, his heart still racing, but now with a different kind of energy, exhilaration. He had done it. He had shown them. And maybe, just maybe, he had shown himself, too. The room remained still for several seconds, before one of the teachers finally broke the silence. "That was unexpected," she said, her voice low but filled with awe. Another teacher nodded, though his words were caught in his throat. "Incredible," he whispered. But the boy wasn't paying attention to their reactions. He was looking at the door, thinking of the life waiting for him beyond these walls. Of the people who would never believe what had just happened. Of the journey that was just beginning. He wasn't done yet. This was only the start. As he gathered his things and turned to leave, he couldn't help but smile. He had learned something today, about music, about life, and about himself. The teachers continued to whisper, but their words no longer mattered. The boy had already left his mark on them, just as he had left his mark on the violin, on the music, on the world. And as the door clicked shut behind him, they all knew, nothing would ever be the same again. The halls of the academy were quiet as the boy made his way out of the music room, his steps slow, deliberate. He could feel the weight of what had just happened bearing down on him. His heart still raced, but not from the fear of performing, no, it was the aftermath, the realization that his life might have changed in the span of a few minutes. The nervous energy he had carried with him into the room had now been replaced with something heavier, something more complex, uncertainty. As he walked down the hallway, the murmurs from the room still rang in his ears. The teachers were talking, their voices too low to make out, but he could hear the shifts in their tone, shock, admiration, disbelief. They didn't expect him to play like that. They didn't expect him to have anything to offer. But what did it mean now? Was it just a fluke? Was he still that boy they thought he was, or had he somehow proven them wrong? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. It didn't matter. He had done it. He had shown them what he was capable of. Still, the weight of the moment lingered, and it wasn't the music that gnawed at him. It was what came after, the recognition. Or, worse, the lack of it. He had walked into that room hoping to be seen, hoping to be recognized for what he was, someone who had worked hard, sacrificed, and pushed through every doubt. But now, after all of it, after the performance that had stunned everyone into silence, what came next? The first encounter. The answer came the next day when he walked into the school courtyard for lunch. It wasn't the cheers, the congratulations, or even the congratulations he had hoped for. It wasn't the recognition that seemed so natural after such a performance. Instead, as he sat alone at one of the benches, the murmurs from his classmates filled the air, snippets of conversation drifting over to him. "I heard he only got into the academy because of some scholarship," one student said, voice dripping with disdain. "Yeah, and what's with him playing the violin like he's some kind of genius," another one added. "It's all an act. People are just making a big deal out of it." The boy clenched his fists, his stomach twisting with frustration. He didn't care about the whispers, they were nothing new. But today they felt like a blade in his side. They didn't get it. None of them understood. He had grown up in a neighborhood where music wasn't a luxury. It wasn't an art, it was survival. His violin had been a way to escape the chaos around him, a means to understand himself, to express the pain and joy he felt in ways words could never capture. But to them, to everyone else here, it was a gimmick, a stunt. He exhaled, trying to calm himself. His performance the day before had been real. His emotions were real. But the doubt, the assumption that he was just another story meant to entertain them, was beginning to take root in his mind. Before he could get too lost in his thoughts, a figure appeared in front of him. "Hey," a voice said, interrupting his reverie. He looked up to find a girl standing before him, her eyes wide with curiosity, her posture relaxed yet confident. She was one of the few students who had actually watched the performance and had seemed genuinely captivated by his playing. "Can I sit?" she asked, her tone easy but with an edge of caution. She wasn't quite sure where he stood with her. He nodded, though he wasn't sure if he wanted company. Still, her presence felt different than the others. She didn't seem to care about the rumors or the opinions of the other students. She was just there. In the moment. "Thanks," she said, taking a seat next to him, pulling out her lunch. "I'm Jessica," she added after a brief silence. The boy hesitated for a moment before responding. "I'm David." "David," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "That was amazing yesterday, you know. Your performance, I mean. I've never heard anything like it." A wave of warmth spread through him at her words, but the vulnerability he had buried deep inside made him wary of any praise. "It was just a violin performance," he said, trying to downplay it, but even to his own ears, it sounded unconvincing. "No, it wasn't just a performance," Jessica insisted. "I could feel it. What you played wasn't just music. It was like you were telling a story. Like you were living it." David looked at her, unsure how to respond. She was the first person who had said anything like that. Most people just focused on the technicalities or the fact that he was an unexpected performer, but Jessica saw something else in the music. She saw the human side of it, the emotion, the soul. "You really think so?" he asked, surprised. "Yeah," she said with a smile. "I mean, no one can fake that kind of passion. I don't know you, but I think you've got something." David didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected someone to understand, especially not someone who didn't know what it was like to be him. The weight of the world still felt heavy on his shoulders, but in that moment, it felt a little lighter. For the first time in a long time, someone had seen him for who he truly was. Not just the boy with the violin, but the person who had lived through struggles most people would never understand. The turning point. The next few days were a blur for David. The whispers about his performance continued, but now, instead of the sneers, there was a different tone. There was curiosity. There were questions, not just about his talent, but about his life, where he came from, what drove him, what made him different. It wasn't always flattering, but at least it wasn't judgment. He could deal with questions, what he couldn't deal with was the feeling of being ignored or dismissed. Jessica continued to seek him out, sitting with him at lunch, talking about everything and nothing. Over time, they became friends, though David didn't know how to categorize their relationship. It wasn't something he had ever expected, but it felt right. She didn't treat him like a charity case, and she didn't look at him with pity. She was simply interested in him, and that was new. One afternoon, as they sat together in the school courtyard, Jessica turned to him with a thoughtful look on her face. "You ever think about what's next?" she asked. "You know, after all this?" David frowned. He hadn't thought much about it. He had only been focused on surviving, on getting through each day. But now, as he looked at her, something inside him stirred. Maybe it was time to think about the future. Maybe he could be more than just the boy with the violin. I don't know, he said honestly. I never really thought I had a future. Jessica raised an eyebrow. You don't think you've got potential? I saw what you did yesterday. That was special. David looked down at his hands, the familiar ache in his chest resurfacing. He wasn't sure he could put everything into words. Maybe I do, he said quietly, but I don't know if anyone else will see it. Jessica smiled, a knowing expression crossing her face. I see it. And I think you can do more than just play the violin, David. You can tell your story. You can do something that matters. People will see you for who you are. For the first time in a long time, David felt a spark of hope. A flicker of possibility. It wasn't just about the violin anymore, it was about everything that came with it. The music, the struggle, the emotions. The idea that he could make a difference in a world that often overlooked him. And so, with Jessica's encouragement, David began to take his first steps toward a future he hadn't dared imagine before. But as he would soon learn, the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would be full of challenges, of doubts, and of people who would still try to tear him down. But David was ready. David had always known that life wasn't meant to be easy. He had learned that lesson early, long before he had ever set foot inside the prestigious music academy. He had learned that it was never about talent alone. It was about fighting, every single day, just to be seen. Just to be heard. And now, after his performance. After everything that had happened, he was left with a question that gnawed at him in every quiet moment: was it really enough? Jessica's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he allowed himself to entertain the idea that maybe it was. Maybe he had more to offer than just the violin. Maybe this wasn't just a fluke, a once-in-a-lifetime performance, but something he could carry with him, something that could truly shape his future. But the doubt, that ever-present doubt, remained. No matter how much he tried to push it down, no matter how much he tried to ignore it, it wouldn't go away. He knew what it was like to be overlooked. He knew the sting of feeling invisible, of being cast aside because of where he came from, who he was. So many times, he had told himself that if he was just a little better, a little faster, a little smarter, he could finally be worthy. But now, after the performance that had stunned his teachers, after everything that had happened, he wasn't sure if he could trust what had happened. Was it his time? Was he finally going to get the opportunity he deserved? The next few days felt like a blur. His routine hadn't changed, he still went to class, still practiced his violin, but there was a palpable shift in the air. People were starting to notice him. The students who had whispered behind his back now looked at him with curiosity, a sense of awe, maybe even a little envy. They couldn't understand it. They couldn't grasp the depths of what he had just done. They didn't know what it took for him to get here. And then, one afternoon, everything shifted again. The invitation. It was a Friday, the end of another week, and David was practicing alone in the music room. The door to the room was closed, the sound of his violin filling the empty space around him. The notes seemed to hang in the air, lingering longer than usual, as if the music itself was reluctant to let go. He had been playing the same piece for hours, trying to capture something elusive, something he couldn't quite name. His mind was scattered, thoughts tumbling over each other. There were things he wanted to say, to express, but the music refused to cooperate. It was like the violin was mocking him, challenging him to dig deeper, to find the truth buried within him. As he stopped for a moment to adjust the strings, the door to the music room creaked open, and in walked one of his teachers, Mr. Allen. The stern-looking man was usually the last person David expected to see without an agenda or criticism, but today, there was something different in his eyes. "David," Mr. Allen said, his voice calm but with an edge of seriousness. "Can I have a word?" David paused, his fingers stilling on the strings. There was something in Mr. Allen's tone that made his heart skip a beat. "Of course, sir. What's up?" Mr. Allen glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the violin in David's hands. Then, without hesitation, he stepped forward, sitting down at the desk in front of David. "I've been watching you," Mr. Allen began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Your performance the other day, it was unexpected. It caught us all off guard, to be honest. But it wasn't just the music that stood out. It was something else, something real." David swallowed, his nerves suddenly taut. He wasn't sure where this conversation was going. "I just played, sir. It wasn't a big deal." "It was a big deal," Mr. Allen corrected him, his gaze steady. "I've been teaching music for years, David, and I've seen countless performances. But your performance had something different. It had heart. And that's why I'm here. I want to offer you an opportunity." David blinked, not quite understanding. "An opportunity?" "That's right," Mr. Allen said, his voice firm now. "There's a prestigious music competition coming up. It's an invitation-only event, but I think you're ready. I think you've got what it takes to be there." David's heart leapt in his chest, but then, doubt followed quickly behind it. He had heard of these competitions, the kind of events where only the best of the best were invited, the ones who came from the right schools, the right families. The idea that he could compete on that level seemed almost impossible. "I don't know, sir. I don't think I'm—" "I know what you're thinking," Mr. Allen interrupted. "But I've seen it before. Talent doesn't always come from the places people expect. And it doesn't always look the way people think it should. What you did on that stage wasn't just performance, it was passion. People want to see that." David shook his head, his emotions rising. "But what if I'm not good enough? What if I fail?" Mr. Allen stood, crossing the room to where David sat. "Let me tell you something, David. Everyone who ever made it to the top was once afraid they weren't good enough. The difference is that they didn't let the fear stop them. You've got the talent. All you need is to believe in it." David stared at the floor, trying to absorb what he was hearing. It felt like his entire world had just tilted on its axis. One moment, he was an invisible kid trying to fit in, and the next, he was being given an opportunity to compete at the highest level. "I don't know if I can," he whispered, more to himself than to Mr. Allen. "You can," Mr. Allen said firmly. "You've already done the hard part. Now all you have to do is step forward." For the first time in his life, David felt a spark of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before: hope. The decision. The next few days were a whirlwind for David. After his conversation with Mr. Allen, his mind raced with possibilities. He went back to practicing, but it wasn't the same. His hands felt lighter, as if the weight of doubt had finally started to lift. But then the fear set in. What if he wasn't ready? What if the competition exposed him for the fraud he feared he was? Jessica noticed the change in him right away. She saw the way he seemed distracted during their lunch breaks, the way his mind appeared to wander as they talked. "Hey, what's going on?" she asked one afternoon. "You seem different." David paused, his eyes meeting hers. He hadn't wanted to tell anyone about the competition. He wasn't sure he was ready to share his fears with anyone. But Jessica had a way of getting under his skin, making him feel like he could trust her. "I've been given an opportunity," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A big one. But I'm not sure I can take it." Jessica's expression softened, her gaze searching his face. "What kind of opportunity?" "A music competition. Invitation only." "Mr. Allen thinks I've got a chance," David said, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. Jessica's eyes widened. "That's incredible. Why wouldn't you take it?" "I'm not good enough," David said quietly, his voice cracking with uncertainty. "I don't fit in. I don't belong in that world." Jessica leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. "David, I've watched you. You belong in whatever world you choose. If you want this, you have to go for it. David felt something shift inside him. Jessica was right. He had spent so long believing he didn't belong, that he wasn't worthy. But maybe it was time to let go of those fears, to step into the unknown. This was his chance, his chance. With renewed determination, David made a decision. He would go for it. He would take the opportunity. He wouldn't let his doubts control him any longer. The following week, David submitted his application for the competition. The fear didn't completely disappear, but it was easier to breathe now. For the first time, David wasn't just playing to survive, he was playing to thrive. He was playing for his future. And now, all he had to do was wait. David stood in front of the mirror, his fingers lightly brushing the polished strings of his violin. His reflection stared back at him, a young man on the verge of something big, something life-changing. But the weight in his chest, the tightness in his throat, told him this wasn't excitement. It was fear. The music competition loomed just days away, and with each passing hour, the anxiety clawed its way deeper into his mind. He had practiced for years, hours upon hours of rehearsing, perfecting his technique, letting the music flow through him. Yet, this felt different. This wasn't just about playing anymore. This was about proving something to the world. Proving something to himself. He glanced down at his hands, the same hands that had played countless melodies, the same hands that had been bruised, scarred, and calloused by years of hard work. But today, they felt weak. Trembling, almost. He had never felt so vulnerable. Never had the stakes been so high. Are you ready for this? He muttered to his reflection, but the question was rhetorical. The answer wasn't one he could give easily. The truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know if he was truly ready for what lay ahead. Was he good enough? Would his passion and dedication be enough to match the expectations of the prestigious judges? And more than anything, could he do it? The doubts continued to swirl, each one feeding off the other, growing larger, louder. And yet, in the midst of it all, he knew he couldn't back down now. Not after everything he had done to get here. Not after everything he had overcome. The competition was an opportunity, the opportunity that he had fought for. He couldn't afford to let it slip away out of fear. Not now. Jessica's support. The following morning, David met Jessica outside the school, where they had agreed to meet for their usual lunch break. She was already waiting, sitting on the steps, her face a little too serious for their usual banter. She had been noticing the change in him, the tension that had crept into his every move. "Hey," she said softly as David approached, giving him a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You okay?" David forced a grin, but it didn't feel real. "Yeah, just a little nervous," he admitted, his voice strained. He could see that she wasn't fooled by his facade. "You've been practicing non-stop," Jessica observed, tilting her head slightly. "Are you trying to perfect something or just avoid thinking about the competition?" David chuckled, but it sounded empty. "Both," he said. "It's like, no matter how much I practice, I feel like I'm just not enough." Jessica reached over and squeezed his hand. Her touch was warm and reassuring, grounding him in the moment. "David, I've heard you play. And I know you're good. But I also know you. You've got more heart than anyone else I've ever met. That's what sets you apart. The judges will see that too. They won't just hear your music, they'll feel it." David let out a slow breath. Her words made him feel lighter, but the unease inside him didn't completely fade. "What if they don't?" he asked quietly. "What if they think I'm just some kid who doesn't belong there?" Jessica looked him dead in the eye, her expression fierce, unwavering. "Then they're wrong. But I don't think they will. You're not just some kid, David. You're you. You've got something no one else has, and that's why you'll make it." David stared at her, the knot in his chest loosening a little. It was amazing how she could make him feel like he wasn't alone in this. Even in the moments when his doubts screamed at him, Jessica was there, reminding him of who he was and what he had to offer. "I don't know what I'd do without you," David said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. Jessica smiled, her eyes warm. "You'll never have to find out," she said, her tone playful but with an undercurrent of sincerity. "I'll be here, cheering you on. Always." The night before the competition. The night before the competition, David couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing with endless thoughts. It wasn't just the competition that kept him awake. It was the uncertainty. The fear of failure. The fear of falling short when he had already come so far. He had never doubted his passion for music, but now, as he lay in the dark, he doubted everything else. Could he actually do this? Could he prove to the world, to himself, that he was more than just a kid with a violin? Could he stand before the judges and give a performance worthy of the opportunity he had been given? As if on cue, his phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. David reached over and grabbed it, seeing Jessica's name on the screen. "Jessica, you've got this, David. I believe in you. Tomorrow, you'll show them who you really are." A small smile tugged at the corners of David's lips as he read the message. It was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he needed to hear. He typed back quickly, "Thank you, Jess. I'll try my best. For you. Jessica, I know you will. No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already proven something incredible. You're not just playing for the judges, David. You're playing for yourself." David let out a shaky breath. It was just what he needed to hear. He wasn't just doing this for the competition or the validation of others. He was doing it for himself, to prove that he could rise above the doubt, the fear, and the obstacles. To show the world, and most importantly, himself, that he was worthy. The competition begins. The day of the competition arrived far too quickly. David stood backstage, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited for his turn. The auditorium was filled with performers, all of them incredibly talented, all of them with their own stories, their own struggles. David felt small in comparison, like an imposter in a world that didn't belong to him. He had spent the last few hours pacing, practicing, trying to calm his nerves, but nothing helped. The fear remained, a constant hum in his chest. His hands were clammy, his mind racing with every possible negative outcome. "You're up next," a voice called from behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. David turned around to see one of the competition organizers standing in the doorway, a clipboard in hand. "Good luck," the man said with a quick nod before disappearing. David took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He didn't feel ready. He didn't feel strong. But he had to do this. For himself. For everything he had worked for. When the doors to the stage opened, David stepped out into the spotlight. The audience was a blur in front of him, their faces indistinguishable, their expectations unknown. He couldn't focus on them. He couldn't let himself get lost in their judgment. Instead, he closed his eyes and thought of everything that had brought him here, the music, the practice, the struggles, the people who believed in him. Most of all, he thought of Jessica, her unwavering faith in him, her words of encouragement that had carried him through the darkest moments. David lifted his violin, placed the bow against the strings, and began to play. The performance. The music flowed from him like a river, each note a testament to the years of pain, growth, and determination. His hands moved across the strings with grace, his bow gliding with precision, but it wasn't just the technical skill that stood out. It was the emotion, the soul that poured through the notes. He wasn't just playing a piece of music, he was telling a story, sharing his heart with the audience. The judges were silent, their faces unreadable, but David didn't care. He wasn't performing for them anymore. He was performing for himself, for the boy who had once doubted his worth, for the boy who had always been told he wasn't good enough. When the final note hung in the air, David's heart pounded in his chest, his hands trembling slightly from the exertion. He opened his eyes to see the judges staring at him in stunned silence. The room was quiet, so quiet that David thought he might be hearing things. And then, slowly, one of the judges began to clap. Another followed suit, then another. Soon, the entire auditorium was clapping, and David felt his heart soar. He had done it. He had proven to them, but more importantly, he had proven to himself that he was worthy. David had never known time to stretch like this. Every second felt like an eternity after he had left the stage. As he walked backstage, the roar of the applause still echoed in his ears. His heart was racing, his mind still swirling with the emotions of the performance. He had done it. He had poured his soul into those notes, those strings, and he felt as though a part of him had been left behind on that stage. But in a way, it was liberating. There had been something electric in the air during his performance. For the first time, he didn't care what the judges thought, or what the audience expected. He had closed his eyes and played from the deepest part of himself, the music taking over. It was just him and the violin, nothing else. As he sat in the waiting room backstage, trying to catch his breath, he noticed the other performers, some of them sitting in nervous silence, others talking in quiet tones, trying to calm themselves. They were all incredibly talented, some of them more technically skilled than him. But David couldn't help but feel that something was different about what he had just done. He wasn't sure if it was his nerves or the weight of what had just happened, but there was a feeling in his chest, something akin to pride mixed with a deep, gnawing fear. What if it wasn't enough? What if his heart, his passion, wasn't enough to carry him through this competition? The judge's decision. Hours later, David found himself standing in the crowded hallway of the competition hall, waiting for the judge's final decision. The other participants were gathered in small groups, whispering to each other, occasionally glancing at the large screen that would soon display the names of the finalists. David stood in silence, feeling strangely detached from the moment. He had given his all on that stage, and yet, he knew that no matter the outcome, something had already shifted within him. He had finally taken control of his destiny, pushed beyond his own limits, and performed for something more than just a trophy or a title. It had been for himself. But still, he couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation. The need to know if the effort would be enough, if the judges would recognize him, and if he had done enough to prove that he belonged here. Finally, the screen flickered on, and the judges' names appeared. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. One by one, the names of the finalists began to scroll across the screen. David's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as he waited for his name to appear. His hands clenched at his sides. He could hear the whispers around him as other names were called out, but his mind was focused solely on the screen. And then, just as he thought he might burst from the pressure, he saw it. His name. David Mills. A rush of adrenaline surged through his body, and for a moment, he couldn't believe it. He had made it to the final round. He had done it. The overwhelming feeling of relief washed over him, followed quickly by something more complicated, fear. What would happen next? What if the final round was even more grueling? What if he wasn't ready for what was to come? But before he could process the weight of the moment, a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey," Jessica said, her voice low but full of excitement. She had found him in the crowd, and her eyes sparkled with pride as she caught sight of him. "I knew you'd make it." David managed a small smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I can't believe it," he said, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. "I actually made it." "I told you that you had this in you," Jessica said, her voice warm with sincerity. She stepped closer, resting a hand on his arm in support. "But you know, the real test is yet to come. It's not just about the performance anymore, it's about what you do with this opportunity. David nodded, taking a deep breath. I know. I feel like I've already pushed beyond everything I thought I was capable of. But, now I'm scared that I won't be able to handle the pressure. Jessica squeezed his arm reassuringly. You'll be fine. You've already proven to yourself that you can do this. Just keep going. Don't overthink it. Play from the heart, like you did before. David looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he truly believed her words. Jessica wasn't just a friend or a cheerleader, she had become his anchor. She reminded him of who he was when the world tried to make him forget. She had been the one constant in a world that had constantly challenged him. The final round. The next day, David found himself backstage again, waiting for the final round of the competition to begin. His nerves were heightened now, the anticipation crawling under his skin. The auditorium was much larger this time, the audience filled with more important people, judges, sponsors, music professionals, all watching him. He could feel the weight of their gazes even though he couldn't see their faces. The lights in the auditorium were blinding, and the stage seemed to stretch farther than it had before. He was no longer just a kid with a violin, he was David Mills, finalist, a name people were starting to recognize. When his turn came, David took a deep breath before stepping onto the stage. The bright lights almost made him dizzy as he faced the audience, his mind racing with all the possibilities. There was no turning back now. As he positioned his violin, ready to play, he looked out into the sea of faces. For a moment, everything felt impossibly distant, and he could feel the uncertainty clawing at him. What if they didn't like his performance? What if they thought he didn't belong here? But then, just like the night before, a memory of Jessica's words filled his mind, play from the heart. The moment his bow touched the strings, something shifted. The music didn't just spill from him, it exploded. His hands were no longer trembling with fear. They were steady, purposeful, guiding the bow with confidence. This was it. This was his chance to truly show the world who he was. And he wasn't going to let fear stop him. David's eyes closed as the music enveloped him. The room faded away, and all that remained was the sound of the violin, the melody that he had come to call his own. It was no longer about technique or precision. It was about the message he had to share, the emotions he had to convey. Every note was infused with his story, his struggle, and his journey. For the next few minutes, he played as if his life depended on it. The music soared, crashing against the walls of the auditorium like a wave, its intensity building and building, before finally reaching its crescendo. When the final note echoed through the room, David held his breath, his bow frozen in place. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat, deafening in the silence. And then, the applause came, slow at first, hesitant even, but then growing louder, building into a storm of appreciation. The judges stood, clapping with a fervor that David had never imagined. He opened his eyes, his chest heaving with emotion, and saw them, every single one of them, on their feet. But it wasn't just the judges' approval that made him smile. It was the feeling that washed over him, the realization that he had finally found himself. He had proven that he was worthy, not just to the judges, but to everyone who had ever doubted him, including himself. The decision, a new beginning. The final results would come later that evening, but David already knew something had changed. He wasn't the same person who had stepped onto that stage months ago. He wasn't just a boy with a violin anymore, he was an artist, a survivor, someone who had learned to trust his heart, even when everything around him screamed to play it safe. As he walked off the stage, his mind still buzzing with the echoes of the performance, Jessica was waiting for him, her smile bright and proud. "You did it," she said, her voice full of awe. David didn't say anything at first. He simply pulled her into a tight hug, finally allowing the weight of everything to wash over him. He had made it. And for the first time, he truly believed in himself. David stood on the edge of the stage, his heart still racing from the final performance. The applause had died down, but the warmth of it lingered in his chest, like a comfortable blanket. He had done everything he set out to do, he had given his all, bared his soul to the audience, and most importantly, he had finally proven to himself that he could do it. But as he stepped into the backstage area, a quiet emptiness washed over him. He had expected to feel a sense of triumph, of relief, but now that the performance was over, he was left with an unsettling question: what now? The judges had seemed impressed. The applause had been overwhelming. But would it be enough? Had he done enough to secure the future he had been dreaming of for so long? "David," a voice called from behind him, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see Jessica standing there, her face flushed with excitement and pride. She was beaming at him, her eyes sparkling with admiration. "You were amazing," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I could feel everything. You gave it your all. You're incredible." David managed a small smile, though the weight of uncertainty still pressed down on him. "I don't know, Jess," he said, his voice soft. "I feel like I did everything right, but what if it wasn't enough? What if it wasn't enough to make a difference?" Jessica stepped closer, her gaze steady. "David, listen to me. You've already made a difference. You didn't just play music, you shared your story. You showed the world who you are. And that's something no one can take away from you." David looked at her, searching her face for reassurance. He had always found solace in her presence, but now, with the competition behind him and the uncertainty of what came next, it felt like there was nothing solid to cling to. "I don't know if I can believe that," he admitted. "I've always been told that being enough means being perfect. What if I'm not good enough? What if I've been living this dream for nothing?" Jessica's expression softened, and she reached out, gently cupping his face with both hands. "You're already enough, David. You've always been enough. Just because you don't get what you think you deserve right now doesn't mean you've failed. It just means that the right opportunity might not have come yet. But it will. You just have to trust that it will." David closed his eyes, allowing her words to settle into him. For the first time in days, he felt a small sense of peace. She had always been his grounding force, his anchor when everything felt like it was spinning out of control. But even with her support, the nagging fear remained. What if the judges didn't see what he had to offer? What if he wasn't meant for this world of music after all? The results, the wait. The competition was over, but the results would not be announced until the following day. The wait was torturous for David. He barely slept that night, his mind racing with thoughts of what could have been. He had worked so hard, poured everything he had into that performance, but it wasn't just about the applause, it was about the recognition, the chance to prove that he had a future in this world of music. He spent the night pacing, playing his violin in the silence of his room, trying to calm his mind, but nothing worked. The questions kept swirling. Would the judges choose him? Would they see past the surface and recognize the heart he had poured into every note? His phone buzzed several times throughout the night with messages of support from Jessica, but even her encouraging words couldn't calm the storm inside him. It was as if the weight of his entire future hung in the balance, and the uncertainty was unbearable. At dawn, David finally gave up on sleep. He walked to the window of his room, staring out at the city, the early morning light casting long shadows across the streets below. He had always felt small in this world, a nobody from a neighborhood where dreams were only fleeting glimpses. But now, standing there in the quiet morning, he realized that he had come so far, further than he ever imagined possible. Even if the competition didn't work out in his favor, he had already accomplished something. He had made them listen. The announcement. The auditorium was packed once again when David arrived that afternoon. The air was thick with anticipation, the energy palpable as the finalists gathered for the announcement. The judges were seated at the front, their faces solemn and unreadable, and the sponsors and spectators filled the seats behind them. David sat quietly among the other contestants, his hands clenched in his lap, his stomach twisting in knots. His mind was blank, the silence around him deafening. The tension in the room was so thick it felt suffocating. Every heartbeat seemed to echo in his chest as he waited for the announcement. Finally, one of the judges, a well-dressed woman with a kind face, stepped forward. The room fell silent, all eyes trained on her as she began to speak. "Thank you to all of our incredible finalists," she said, her voice rich with authority and warmth. "You have each demonstrated exceptional talent, and we are honored to have had the privilege of watching you perform. The decision has not been easy, as you are all incredibly gifted. But after careful deliberation, the judges have selected one winner to receive the grand prize and an opportunity to further their music career with a full scholarship." David's heart skipped a beat. The words he had been waiting for, the ones that would change everything, were finally here. But as the judge continued, the weight of the moment began to sink in. "The winner of this year's competition," the judge said, pausing for dramatic effect, "is..." David held his breath. His palms were slick with sweat, his mouth dry. His eyes flickered from one contestant to the next, but the room seemed to narrow, every noise fading away except for the judge's next words. "David Mills." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. His mind went blank, and for a split second, he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. His name echoed in his ears, and the next thing he knew, the entire room was clapping, rising to their feet in a wave of applause. David stood frozen, his legs shaky, as the weight of the announcement crashed over him. He had won. He had actually won. Jessica was the first to reach him, her arms wrapping around him in a tight hug, her voice filled with joy. "You did it, David. I knew you could." David couldn't speak. He was too overwhelmed. His body felt numb as he walked toward the stage, the sound of the applause ringing in his ears. He didn't remember climbing the steps, didn't remember standing in front of the judges as they handed him the trophy and congratulated him. The only thing he could focus on was the feeling of disbelief washing over him. He had done it. He had actually done it. The realization. As David walked off the stage, his trophy in hand, the enormity of the moment began to sink in. This wasn't just about the victory or the recognition. It was about the journey that had led him here, the struggles, the doubts, the fear. He had come so far from the boy who had once wondered if he would ever be good enough. He had proven to himself that he was. He was enough. And now, with the scholarship and the opportunity to further his music career, everything was different. His future was no longer a question. It was a reality. As he stood backstage, alone for the first time since the announcement, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The fear that had held him back for so long was gone. The world was full of possibilities, and for the first time in his life, he believed he had the strength to take them on. Jessica found him a moment later, her smile wide and proud. She had watched him from the sidelines, had supported him through every doubt, every setback. And now, standing before him, she was the one person who truly understood the significance of this moment. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You really did it." David looked at her, his heart full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Jess," he said softly. "You were the one who made me believe." Jessica smiled, her eyes shining. "You always had it in you, David. You just needed to see it." A new beginning. The days that followed the competition were a whirlwind for David. The scholarship was just the beginning, he had interviews, training, and performances ahead of him. But as much as everything was moving so fast, David couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for where he was, for the journey that had brought him here. He had come to understand something that he hadn't before: success wasn't just about winning or being recognized, it was about the courage to keep going when the odds seemed impossible. It was about believing in yourself, even when others didn't, and trusting that your hard work would eventually pay off. And as he looked out at the horizon, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead, David knew that this was only the beginning of his story. The road to success wasn't always straight, and the challenges weren't always easy to overcome, but with determination and the right people by his side, there was nothing he couldn't achieve.